The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
It took their sons to persuade both these women that they should adopt the idea of votes for women, because both Franklin and Winston realized that that's the way that the political tides were running.
Then, later on The Agenda.
Canada Pension Plan is not guaranteed by the Government of Canada, thank you very much. It is not Government of Canada money. It's money contributed by employers and employees, and so hands off.
Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt are two of the greatest leaders in the history of democracy. In fact, we apparently admired Churchill so much that in 1977, they erected a statue to Churchill here on the west end of Nathan Phillips Square. Their exploits in winning World War II are well known. What's less well known is the influence their two mothers had on their success. Well, that is not a problem any longer, thanks to Charlotte Gray, who has just written this book, Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, The Lives of Jennie Jerome Churchill and Sara Delano Roosevelt. Charlotte and I had a conversation about these two historic women just a stone's throw from here at the Royal Canadian Military Institute.
I decided to write about these two figures because I'm fascinated by the way that, whatever the restrictions on their lives, women have made choices and shaped the space available to their own purposes. Neither Jennie Jerome Churchill nor Sara Delano Roosevelt would have considered herself a powerful actor in the patriarchal society in which she lived, where financial and political power belonged to men and women were assessed almost entirely through the male gaze. Sara and Jennie are such delicious opposites, one so relentlessly old-fashioned, the other so daringly non-traditional. Their ambitious sons were lucky to have such formidable mothers.
Charlotte, it's so great to see you again.
It's great to be back here with you, Steve.
Absolutely. A ton has been written about the sons of these two women. How much has been written about the two mothers themselves?
Not a lot. Quite a lot about Jennie Churchill, Churchill's mother, because she was a quite colourful character, and she was slightly scandalous in her own years. So she attracted more attention than Sara Roosevelt, Franklin's mother, because Sara was one of those women of her period who felt that her role was at home. It didn't mean to say she wasn't a very strong personality, but researching her was more difficult.
As you did the research, did you discover that you had a particularly different take on the narrative surrounding these two women that would have been different from what's been the conventional wisdom to date?
Male biographers of these two sons, Winston and Franklin, have always seen the mothers through their motherhood role and nothing else. Because I've discovered that the biographers of male heroes, of the great men of history, want to just race through the early years. They want to portray their heroes as springing fully formed and ready to take charge of the world. So often the male biographers, and they are all male biographers of those two guys, by the way, they dismiss the mothers. In fact, they don't just dismiss them and their influence. They can be positively critical and say, despite the unhappiness and the problems of their upbringing, these two men turned out to be extraordinary national leaders. In fact, if you read what the two men themselves said about their mothers, they both admitted to huge debts to them.
You have just done what you've done numerous times during the text, because I read the book, and you frequently refer to the fact that the biographers, all men incidentally, so I infer from that you think that if history had been written by women, as you are writing history, we'd have had a different take on a lot of this stuff. Is that right?
Yes, I do think that. And it isn't just, whether or not I'm a feminist. It's also the balance of history. Generally, history has always been described and written. The most important aspects of it are all military and political. And don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely in agreement that those are two very important streams in history. But we have really ignored social history, especially in this country, which has always been a sort of macho country built on primary resources, and where for most of the post-settler history, it's been a poverty-stricken country, just struggling to survive.
Well, let's not make that mistake here. Let us focus on what you have, and let's start with this. These women had a lot in common. Why don't you give us a bit of a list of the things they shared?
The things they shared included the year they were born, 1854, the class into which they were born, which was the one percenters of New York society, very wealthy families, a sense of entitlement, and a wonderful taste in gowns. Their life arcs also showed remarkable similarities. They both did everything that was expected of them in terms of finding appropriate husbands, having wonderful courtships, honeymoons, immediately looking to have a child so that they could carry on family traditions. And then, in fact, there were huge differences between what happened in those marriages, but then they're both widowed very early.
In their 40s?
In their 40s. And in both cases, their sons then became absolutely key to their lives. Their devotions to their sons were probably one of the sort of guiding principles of their lives.
Both born in New York State. Was it unusual for a regal person in Britain, as Lord Churchill was, to be marrying outside of the country?
By the time that he married Jennie, Lord Randolph Churchill, who, as you say, was, the second son of the Duke of Marlborough, so he lived in that sort of tiny, cozy little world of British toffs with big houses. By the time he married Jennie, those toffs in big houses were in trouble. Their fortunes were crumbling, they needed money, they had no idea how to actually earn a living themselves, and they were beginning to look at American heiresses as a potential source of money. Now, Lord Randolph and Jennie genuinely just fell in love, and it was not a good marriage in the view of the Duke of Marlborough, Randolph's father, because Jennie had no money to speak of. Although she was born into that very wealthy class, her father was known as the King of Wall Street, and he was a speculator. So he was, by Manhattan standards, nouveau riche, and his fortunes went up and down. Nonetheless, it was unusual to marry an American in 1874. But Jennie, she had enough panache to carry it off. And she was also a social chameleon. She learnt so fast the habits, the language, the social mores, the nicknames of the British aristocracy. And she flirted outrageously, and they all fell in love with her.
We will get to that, because you've got some good detail on that. How many months after their marriage, Randolph and Jennie Churchill, did Winston show up?
Well, if you believe their narrative, he was born prematurely. 2 months prematurely.
Which suggests
that I told you it was a passionate love affair, and it suggests premarital passion.
Can we say that Winston Churchill was a bastard child?
No, because his parents were married when he was born.
I guess that's right. But they weren't when he was conceived.
I cannot date the conception.
Okay. You've not been able to confirm that, eh?
I can't confirm
with
that.
Primary sources.
If you can't get it in the primary sources, you can't make it up.
Understood. Okay. Jennie Churchill seemed like quite a hands-off mother, right? She wouldn't breastfeed Winston. A governess basically raised him. Was that typical for the time?
It was. And she has been criticized quite a lot for that. But she wasn't doing anything that, in fact, most sort of aristocratic mothers weren't doing at the time. They always had, some breastfed their children, but most didn't. They had wet nurses. Some kept their children at home with them, but they all had nannies, and of course armies of servants. And then these little boys were all sent off to prep schools very early, and then to their public schools, as they're called in Britain, their high schools. So there was nothing unusual about the way Jennie treated Winston. She was probably a little bit lax in terms of going and visiting him in school and things.
He missed her.
He missed her, but he was a very needy little boy. And he also quite manipulative. And so she could have done a lot more, but she had this other preoccupation, which was a husband, Lord Randolph Churchill, who was a very difficult, demanding, needy man, who was, it now appears, slowly going mad because he had syphilis, and being more and more difficult to handle, and getting furious with Winston and his younger brother Jack, because Lord Randolph had no time for being a father. He showed very little affection for either of his sons.
You are very gentle in the language with which you say Jennie led, quote unquote, an active romantic life. What does that mean?
It meant that I think she stopped sleeping with her husband quite soon after, so actually probably quite soon after Winston was born, and it's not clear exactly who Jack, Winston's younger brother, who his father was. And I think this is partly because by now they knew that, or it was suspected that Lord Randolph had syphilis. But Jennie had a libido, and Jennie was a flirt, and she always had a bevy of admirers, and she always said that she never slept with somebody else's husband, but there were plenty of loose young men available, and she did have affairs. She was discreet. It was not unusual in her circles, but any woman who does that then and now is sort of slut-shamed, whereas a man who does it is still admired.
The double standard is an important point because John F. Kennedy, of course, had legendary affairs, and all of the people who covered him kept all that stuff quiet, didn't write about it. But a woman tries it and it's a different story, right?
Absolutely, yeah, it's seen as shameful. And Jennie was great because she just stared down and faced and laughed off the nasty remarks. She said, "What do I care?"
Let's now focus on Sara Roosevelt, a much more hands-on mother with Franklin.
Today she'd be described as a helicopter parent. I mean, Winston said about Jennie, she was like the evening star for me, twinkling but in the distance. For Franklin, I mean, his mother was never far from him, and she resented any kind of intrusion. She sacked the nanny that her husband had found for when Franklin was first born. She insisted on breastfeeding Franklin herself until he was a year old. She very rarely ever left him out of her sight. She wept when she cut off his baby curls when he was 7. He didn't have a bath by himself until he was 7 or 8. When he went to his boarding school, Groton, if he didn't write to her twice a week, she'd call the principal of the school because she was convinced he must be sick. And then when he went to Harvard, she rented an apartment in Boston so she'd be near to him.
Do you think that's a bit much?
I think it's far too much. And of course what happened was that Franklin, who did love her and depended on her a lot, but he developed all these strategies for keeping her at arm's length.
You do say that she ensured that her son rarely endured a moment of uncertainty about his place in the world. What does that mean?
He knew he was special. He was special to his mother, and his mother had a great sense of the importance of the Delano and the Roosevelt families in the world, and he therefore knew that his place was absolutely solid. And she adored him. She was quite strict in some ways, but he never felt a moment's doubt in his self-image. He was completely self-confident.
There's a story you tell in the book, and when you told it, the first thing I thought of was that amazing scene at the White House where John F. Kennedy is welcoming all of the kids, and Bill Clinton is one of those kids, and they shake hands, and it's been captured for posterity. Current president meets future president. This happened with FDR. James Roosevelt, his dad, takes him to the White House to say farewell to Grover Cleveland, the president. And Grover Cleveland actually says to Franklin Roosevelt, "My little man, I am making a strange wish for you. It is that you may never be president of the United States." That is a great story, but is that really true? Did this really happen?
Well, it's certainly in Sarah's memoirs, which is where I got the story from, and many other biographers have as well. And I can imagine Grover Cleveland saying that because this was not a great stage of his presidency. I could also imagine that Franklin paid absolutely no attention.
Well, clearly not. He had 4 terms.
or 3.5 anyway, 3 and a bit. Okay, both women, as you pointed out, were widowed in their 40s. That's a lot to deal with. How did they handle it?
They handled it quite differently, but what they had in common with the way they handled it was that they did not retire into the sort of obscurity of grief. They did not sort of disappear from the world. In Jennie's case, she did disappear from London. She went straight to Paris because she really couldn't stand the idea of hanging around London dressed head to toe in black, which was not her style. And frankly, Lord Randolph's death, although she was grief-struck, but it was a huge relief. He had been so difficult at the end. I mean, he was raving mad by the end. And he, at one point, pulled a gun on her. So she went to Paris, where she recovered her spirits and realized that she could now more legitimately take lovers, and she could go to the House of Worth and order more gowns and follow the kind of things she loved. She just enjoyed life. I mean, that's one of the things about Jennie. She had real joie de vivre. Sarah, equally devastated when James Roosevelt dies, but she too refused to sort of retreat into grief. She continued all the things she'd always enjoyed, including annual trips to Paris, where she had a sister living. But her main focus is now Franklin, whose career and whose education she pursues with a vengeance. For her, the shock is that Franklin, aged 22, suddenly springs it upon her that he's engaged to his cousin. And Sarah doesn't know what to do about this. She had no idea. I don't know how she missed it, because, you know, most mothers would have fingertips to know that their son was having a love affair. But Eleanor Roosevelt had come into Franklin's life. They were determined to get married very early. I think in some ways it was a decision on Franklin's part to separate himself a little from his mother. But Sarah adapted by realizing that Eleanor at this stage was a pretty sort of shy, rather withdrawn young woman who had been damaged by a miserable, miserable childhood. And Sarah took a deep breath and took charge and made sure that the wedding was perfect. In fact, President Teddy Roosevelt gave the bride away. She organized the house that they would move into in Manhattan. And I don't think Eleanor could have survived the early years of her marriage without her mother-in-law's help.
And they ended up having a good relationship, yes?
No. No, they ended up having a relationship which went from the dependence of the early years to Eleanor finally, as the children got older and left home, realizing her own strengths, her own potential, and taking on more and more roles outside the home. She could do that because there was always Sarah there, sort of making sure that the children went to boarding school, that the children were looked after. Eleanor started doing her thing, teaching, developing close relationships with women, and just got angry at her mother-in-law's sort of pretentiousness and possessiveness. And one of the ways that Sarah's reputation has actually been distorted is that one of the best sources on Sara Roosevelt are the memoirs that Eleanor subsequently wrote after Sarah's death. And in each of these memoirs, Sarah is more and more critical of her mother-in-law, who she said even sort of when she was looking at Sarah on her deathbed, she wrote to a friend, you know, I never really liked her.
Sarah made it to a good old age, right? She got into her 80s?
Oh, yes, she was in her late 80s, and she was absolutely determined, while Franklin was president, that she'd be there for him.
Now, Jennie, conversely, had a second marriage, also not great, and had a very sad demise. Her death was terrible.
She did. I mean, first of all, she married a man who was the same age as her son, Winston, and they had a gay old time for a period, but then that went off the rails, and they got a divorce. And she married again, this time a man younger than her son, Winston. I mean, Jennie grabbed life with both hands, and her death was very sudden. What had happened was that she finally had some money. She'd by now realized that because she had great taste, she could flip houses and decorate them and actually make some money doing this. She was very successful. She had a pile of money. She went to Italy to stay with a friend, bought a wicked pair of Italian sandals, wore them, tripped, fell, broke her ankle. She got gangrene in the leg. It had to be amputated. She continued to be this wonderful, fiery Jennie. What she said was, I'll just have to put my best foot forward. But then suddenly there was a massive bleed. She went into a coma and she died in 1921. And it was a real tragedy. It was on all the newspaper hoardings throughout London. And Winston ran in his pajamas through the streets, desperate to get there before she passed.
Which leads me to the next question. How did both men react to the deaths of their mothers, admittedly at different times in their lives?
Winston, as I said, was devastated. He had the plaster cast of Jennie's arm and hand on his desk throughout his career. He was very quiet for a while, but then resumed his career. But he always spoke of her with great love. Franklin disappeared for 2 or 3 days after Sarah's death. And at one point, a few days later, he was unpacking some of her boxes and found her keepsakes, which included, his first baby shoes and a lock of his baby hair. And he asked the archivist who was helping him, could she leave him for a few minutes? And the archivist said, this was the first time that any of us employed by the president had ever seen a tear in his eye. And this is sort of the president who went to war.
Both men got into politics. For one, Roosevelt, it might not have been something that his mother wanted. For Jennie Churchill, her son going into politics was in some respects the family business, so maybe not a shock there. But talk more about that if you would, about how both mothers reacted to their son's entry into public life.
I think Jennie always wanted Winston Churchill to go in because it was going to be vengeance for the way her husband had been treated, because Lord Randolph had resigned from cabinet, assuming, because then he was a sort of the golden hope for the Conservative Party, and he assumed that he would be invited back and given a big job. He was Deputy Prime Minister with a different title at that stage. And then, in fact, the Prime Minister said, well, thank you very much, sorry you're going. And Lord Randolph's political career just fizzled out. And Jennie had been longing to be the wife of the Prime Minister. So she decided if she couldn't be the wife of a Prime Minister, she'd be the mother of the Prime Minister, and encouraged Winston all along, with all her connections and everything, to go into politics.
Which and did at 26.
Yes, very young.
Yeah.
In contrast, Sarah and her husband James thought that politics was a grubby business. It was sort of not really suitable for Roosevelts, who were gentlemen and landowners. And she was horrified at the idea that Franklin would go into politics. Once he said, well, I'm going to anyway, she said she did a complete pivot and backed him all the way. If Franklin's going to run, I want to make sure he can win. And her money was crucial to all his various election campaigns.
When they were in politics at the beginning, I don't think women could vote.
Correct.
And yet both mothers were not suffragettes. They were not champions of women getting the vote. Why not?
At this stage, both in Britain and in North America, women's suffrage was a class issue to some degree. And upper-class women in both countries felt far greater allegiance and solidarity with their class than with women from other social classes. It would be very hard to persuade Sarah that she and her cook had anything in common and any sort of common problems. In fact, it took their sons to persuade both these women that they should adopt the idea of votes for women, because both Franklin and Winston realized that that's the way that the political tides were running, that if they wanted to win votes, they had to endorse suffrage campaigns. And when they did, finally, their mothers did.
For every author who does a book like this about somebody important in history, there's usually a moment where you get into the archives and you discover a treasure trove of whatever, personal letters, something. And you had a moment like that. What was that like?
I did have a moment like that, 2 moments like that. And you have to remember that I started this pre-COVID, and then just as I was about to go to the archives in Britain for the Churchill archives at Churchill College, Cambridge, and to Hyde Park to the FDR Presidential Library for the Roosevelt papers, the lockdown started. And I mean, I couldn't leave my study, let alone Ottawa or the country or the continent. I finally got to those archives, having written the bulk of the book. And what was glorious was seeing the women's actual handwriting. Because, of course, at Hyde Park, there's Sara's handwriting, which is precise, even, she sticks to the lines, she's methodical, and she's the woman I know, who takes charge and organizes properly and probably has organizational charts. Jennie's letters, scrawling across the page, sort of funny little, whenever she wants to say, your father will be really cross, she just puts an X for cross. She's always in a hurry, never sticks to the lines. And it was glorious. I suddenly felt I really know these two women.
Graphologically speaking.
Graphologically speaking.
You said something a second ago about how there's not necessarily a template for determining greatness in world leaders. However, what state of the Union was Jennie Churchill born in?
New York.
What state of the Union was Sarah Delano born in?
New York.
What state of the Union was William Lyon Mackenzie King's mother born in?
New York.
Have I found the common element here?
Yes. The first book I wrote was about Mrs. King, and the most recent book is about the other two. The common element is mothers of great men.
From New York State.
From New York State.
There's something about the Empire State, you got to admit.
Is that where you were born?
No. No. Such greatness I cannot aspire to, I'm afraid. Well, I'll tell you, now that you've got it all said and done, you know these two women probably better than anybody alive today, right? You probably do, having spent so many years looking into their lives. Can you say that you like one of them better than the other?
No. And that's because, as a biographer, it's not a question of whether you like them or not. It's because you've been trying so hard to understand them and to trace their path through life that you sympathize with both of them. And, there are occasions I feel when Sara was beyond stuffy or where Jennie was simply too outrageous. But I'd love to be in a room with either of them. That being said, I don't think I'd love to be in a room with both of them.
Well, you couldn't have been because they never met, did they?
They never met. They probably did in Paris, but I have no evidence. So although they almost certainly were in the same room, I don't think that they never recorded it.
What a shame. That would have been fun.
Then I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall.
Right on. Charlotte, thanks for this.
This was great, Steve. Thanks so much to you.
Pleasure.
A letter from a Montreal-based investment firm signed by more than 90 Canadian CEOs urges Canadian pension funds to invest more in this country. And now, a working group created in the last federal budget and headed by a former Bank of Canada governor will explore how to make Canada more attractive for pension funds to invest here. But is it churlish of us to ask whether pension funds actually are underinvested in Canada? And if they are, is there a good reason for it? Tonight, three people who would know. Barbara Zvan, President and CEO of University Pension Plan Ontario. She's also former Chief Risk and Strategy Officer for the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Jim Leach, former President and CEO of the aforementioned Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. He was there from 2007 to 14. He's also chair of the advisory board for the Institute for Sustainable Finance. And Keith Ombudshere, Director Emeritus of the International Center for Pension Management at the U of T's Rotman School of Management. And we are delighted to have everybody from A, Ombudshere, to Z, Zvan, and Leach in between. We're going to get the A to Zs today on pension investments here in this country. And just before we start, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up a couple of graphics showing some stats about Canada's 8 largest pension funds. These are known as the Maple 8, and among them, they have about $2 trillion in assets. And here's how it's allocated. I'm not going to go through all the hundreds of billions of dollars of valuation. But just to give you a sense, the Canada Pension Plan has got 14% of its money invested in Canada. The Caisse de dépôt et placement in Quebec, 27%. The Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, about a third. The public sector, about 22%. Let's keep going. BC Investment Management, about 29%. Alberta Investment Management, 43%. OMERS, the Ontario Municipal Employees, 24%. And Healthcare of Ontario is the biggest one there at 55%. Okay, Keith, to you first. Given this data, how would you characterize the Maple 8's level of investment in Canada?
They're overinvested.
Overinvested?
They're overinvested.
Even though one's only over 50%?
If you use the sort of the normal standard of the structure of the global financial market, and you look at Canada's position in that, certainly on the equity side, for example, is 3%. We're 3% of the total global market. So when you see numbers like 10% and 20% and 30%, that's overinvested.
Barbara, what would you say?
Well, it depends. So all these pension plans have Canadian dollar liabilities, or they own a pension promise in Canadian dollars. So there's certain types of assets that you want in Canadian dollars. So take it, Canadian government bonds as a nice hedge portfolio, and there's less desire to go foreign for that. But in other areas, we just don't see the opportunities in Canada in certain types of asset classes, like infrastructure is a great example. And to get that diversification across countries as well as types of assets, we go elsewhere.
What's your percentage at your fund?
We're about 40%.
40. So that's on the high side compared to the Maple 8.
That's right.
And you're comfortable with that, obviously.
We're comfortable with that given the makeup of it, yes.
Okay. Jim Leach, what do you say?
Well, they're both right. It depends on, as Barb said, first of all, there are reasons to be in Canada. One is currency. All of the obligations of these pension plans are in Canadian dollars, so that's a reason to be overweight in Canada. Another reason is that we have a bit of an informational advantage in Canada. We're here, we know what's going on compared to our foreign competitors, etc. By the same token, you have to have a diversified portfolio. And as Keith said, only 3% of the equity markets are in Canada, so anything over 3% in equity would be termed as overweighted. But there's another type of diversification one needs to get from the demographics. So different countries have different demographics. You may want to spread into a younger population or an older population to be investing in. And secondly is different industries. So for example, if you want big exposure to 5 Canadian banks and a whole bunch of strong resource companies, yes, the Toronto Stock Exchange is a place to be. But if you want exposure to technology, to consumer products, et cetera, large manufacturing, you're not getting it by investing in the Toronto Stock Exchange, unfortunately. You said you're 40-ish percent?
That's right.
How did you land on that number?
Well, we do, most pension plans will do something called an asset liability. They look at their liabilities, they look at the different assets they can invest in, and they look at 10, 20 years, and factor in as much of the modeling as you can. It's never a perfect exercise. And then they use judgment in terms of, where is the growth, where our opportunities are, and then, usually that leads to a certain amount of bonds that you want as a hedge to interest rates. You're looking for certain types of inflation protection because we all provide pensions that are indexed to the CPI, so we need that in our assets. And we need assets that provide economic growth, and that's really where we try to get the diversification across globally. So that's how it comes out.
So Keith, when this letter came out, signed by all these CEOs saying, come on, pension funds, you ought to be investing more in Canada, what was your reaction when you saw that?
Laughter.
Because?
Because there's just such a big gap between the original writers of that letter, the Montreal investment managers, who manage Canadian assets, and they've been on this track for a long time. And I was actually flabbergasted that they got so many CEOs signing that letter when they should know better.
When you were running Teachers, I'm checking here. Okay, Teachers is $248 billion. Whew, that's big, eh? 35%. Do you remember what the numbers were when you were there?
Probably
around
close to the same. Yeah. It wouldn't have been much different.
And why would you say that that's the right mix?
Well, it's the right mix given the opportunities. As I said, and Barb said before, we'd rather be investing in Canada, or there's an advantage to us investing in Canada, but there aren't the opportunities. I think this question isn't so much how do we force Canadian pension plans to invest more in Canada?
Because you can't, presumably.
Well, they could pass legislation, which would be absolutely
But we've had
retroactive.
it. We had the 10%
We had
for
that.
property rule. Way back when, 90% of the assets had to be invested in Canada.
Yeah.
And we spent a long time and a lot of effort getting rid of that rule.
Well, and why we got rid of the rule is because all the pension plans were in deficit and couldn't get out of deficit. Once those rules were relaxed, once the restructuring and transitioning of the plans happened in the 1980s, 90s, since then, all the plans have moved into balance, due primarily because of higher investment returns.
So it is a better thing that there's no legal obligation for these funds to invest in Canada.
Yes, but
As odd as that sounds.
as odd as that sound, it's a better thing. By the same token, the issue, I think, has actually been worded properly in the budget, which is how do we, the government, Mr. Polas, et cetera, work with the pension plans to determine ways in which they can encourage Canadian pension plans to invest more in Canada, not require, encourage.
Right.
And Australia is a classic example there, where the government there has gone out of their way
Yes.
to make it easy for super funds in Australia to invest in infrastructure in Australia. We haven't done that.
Yeah. So I think actually you have to change the whole question to how do we just get more money in Canada from domestic and foreign
You're
investors.
right. It
For
shouldn't be
everywhere.
limited to pension plans. The foreign investment is a good thing.
Yeah. And pension plans don't act any different than, say, if you are an individual that have to save for your own retirement. You go to usually a retail branch of some sort, and you get a group RSP, or maybe from your employer, or a defined contribution plan. No one's talking about those monies, right? Because at the end of the day, that member or that person is responsible for their retirement income. These pension plans are responsible for the retirement income for all those people in that pension plan. And so we don't want to confuse the mandate. So I have to serve in the best interest of the members in my pension plan. Ontario Teachers has to work in the best interest of their members. And it is providing their pension, because if there's a shortfall, they pay for it, not the federal
I think
government.
that's a good point, and I think it may lead Keith to your amazement that 90 people signed that letter. There was a lot of disinformation going around at that time. I've seen emails from Letco and Brousseau that said these plans are guaranteed by the government, and that is totally wrong. I mean, if these plans go into deficit, it's going to be their members and their employers who bear the burden of increased contributions or lower benefits. Canada Pension Plan is not guaranteed by the Government of Canada, thank you very much. It is not Government of Canada money. It's money contributed by employers and employees, and so hands off.
Now, you were saying something about the Aussies earlier. What are they doing, or what did they do?
So it's the same thing. You've got toll roads, you've got airports, et cetera, et cetera. And there the government has said, what can we do as a government to facilitate super funds in Australia, and for that matter, other countries as well, like Canadian funds, to become investors in Australian infrastructure. And it's going very well.
Why is it going well? How did they encourage it?
Because the rules are set up so that they're clear, they're welcoming, and that's all it takes. And of course, to have an economy that actually is going to generate the returns that you need as a pension fund.
Barbara.
So I was going to expand on that. So the rules, every country, when they privatize infrastructure, it's their choice. And they usually set some sort of regulatory framework that an investor can look at it and say, will I be able to understand the risk profile of this regulatory framework? Will it change on me? What's my implicit rate of return? What am I accountable for? And it's a great investment, because usually it means, there's a good cash yield. There's usually inflation protection involved. But many ways when these investments come to the larger pension plans, and even the smaller one through the investors that we use or the managers we use, they have governance rights. So they sit on the boards of these companies. They look at the operating of these companies, and these are companies you're going to own for a long time. So that's really important. And so you need the attractive, return for the risk that you're taking. You need the governance so you can make sure that it stays that way over the long period of time. And then there's a investment on the time. So you can't come here and say, oh, there's one investment. You know, you're not going to get the mass attraction of investors that are going to come here for one investment. You need that pipeline of opportunities to really attract the investors to say, look, Canada's privatizing. We're going to privatize these things. They'll start spending the time and effort in researching it. If it's one thing, not so much.
Okay, but Jim, when you were running Teachers, was there a part of, I mean, you're a proud Canadian, was there not part of you that thought, you know, it would be really good for the country if I could overweight my portfolio towards Canadian companies?
Well, I certainly spent a lot of time talking to politicians and saying, we would like to invest more in Canada. I would be asked all the time, how come Teachers doesn't have much in infrastructure, where you've got lots of infrastructure investments in Australia, in the UK, in Chile, etc. And I, at one time, this is where I'm leading, one point said, we only invest in regimes that are stable, political regimes. And I said that because our first infrastructure investment that we made in Canada was in AltaLink, which was the electrical distribution business in Alberta that was being sold off. And so we invested in it on the premise of, as Barb said, what the regulations were, and anticipated returns and all of this stuff. Within 12 months of making that investment, the Alberta government regulatory agent halved the allowable rate of return. They cut it in half because we were a pension plan. And I can remember sitting there with our chief investment officer, with the minister from Alberta, and saying, like, are you guys crazy? Because the message you're sending, not just to me, not just to Teachers, but to everybody in the world is, we can't trust you. We cannot trust you. And just to say, I mean, they did it in Ontario too, when Dalton McGuinty's government endeavored to abrogate the contract that was on 407. Now, I'm not saying that contract was good. I think the government blew with that contract. But you don't try to abrogate it all of a sudden because you didn't like the deal that you made.
There was also recent, when November 2022, the federal government had, since the early 90s, issued something called inflation-protected bonds. So they're bonds that are indexed to the CPI. They form a great base in any pension plan portfolio because we provide inflation protection in the pensions. In November 2022, they all of a sudden announced they're stopping the issuance. And so these pension plans own a significant portion of these bonds, and so it effectively becomes a stranded asset over time with no warning, no notice.
So you love it when they change the rules in the middle of the game.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Keith, let me raise, I raised the issue of patriotism because in the province of Quebec, as I understand it, they do have this double mandate. Yes. They not only are expected, the pension funds, to seek the best return possible, but they are, as part of their mission statement, supposed to promote the province of Quebec's economy. We don't do that in Ontario, should we?
Absolutely not. In fact, you know, I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to understand what La Caisse has really done over time. Certainly when you look at just the returns last 10 years, they're considerably lower than, for example, CPP Investment Board. What that's attributed to, you need to dig into the details and understand that. But as soon as you start muddying the waters, then it becomes an uncertain issue as to what qualifies, what doesn't qualify. I mean, the classic example for the world to be looking at right now is what La Caisse is doing with the Montreal transit system, and the fact that they're moving closer to actually playing an operational role, my understanding of it, in actually managing the system. Where does this go? Well, it's an interesting question.
Are you a fan of that idea?
It's risky.
It's risky.
And again, just not to pick on La Caisse, Thames Water in the UK, it's the water system for London, Greater London area. It's owned by pension funds, including Canadian ones. It's not doing very well. So there's a downside to actually, picking the investments and thinking through what does this investment need to be in order to provide sustainable long-term returns. And so the other thing I want to mention in all this that's kind of interesting is the global pension investment community. They all know each other. So they have their own culture and they talk to each other all the time. So it isn't like it's one-off things. They are all understanding what's happening in the different countries.
Gotcha.
That's what I think politicians don't understand. When we use AltaLink, when we use Highway 407, when we, all different examples, the bonds, etc. They may think these are little one-offs, but they're not.
No.
They all accumulate, and everybody in the world knows about it. When I would go to a conference in France or Switzerland or whatever, there are all of them are compatriots from all over the world. And the first question they ask is, what's going on in the province of Ontario where they're trying to cancel a contract? And it's well known.
Contracts are a big deal in your world.
Money has a long memory. It has a very long memory. But
The other irony in all this is that what's evolving at the international level is the adoption of the Canadian pension model from a design point of view, which is an arm's length organization with a clear mandate, good governance, ability to insource if you want. And so that's becoming the global model. And it's being applied very well in various places, but only to the degree that the investments are there and that you don't have the government interference.
Barbara, let me ask you about an asset that has become very well known in the last week or so. There's a pipeline in Western Canada called the Trans Mountain that some people may be interested in. I suspect the federal government would be interested in selling off parts of that.
That's
Would
right.
you be interested in buying parts of that?
Yeah, so when we look at co-investments or doing investments like that, one of the main things that we look at now, say going forward for something like that, because it's quite a liquid asset, you're going to hold this, decade or more, is what is the climate transition plan for that pipeline? So how does it align with, going to net zero by 2050 for Canada? And I would say that that's not really clearly articulated right now. And so most of these pension plans are looking forward, and they have made sustainable finance goals, and they have made commitments around climate. And I think that's going to be one of the hurdles for pension plans looking at that pipeline.
If you were running teachers, would you want a piece of that pipeline?
I think the answer is exactly the same. Would we look at it? For sure we'd look at it, because it's a major asset. It has a long-term life, subject to the sustainability issues surrounding it. But it's the type of asset that a pension plan would look at.
What about, when you were running teachers, was there ever a situation where, let's say, and let's just remind everybody, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of teachers' pensions.
About 340,000 people.
Okay. So a lot of teachers have their pensions and their futures wrapped up in that pension plan. Would a Premier of Ontario ever call you and say, you know what, it would really help us out a lot if you invested in X, Y, or Z?
It's happened, and it wasn't at the Premier level, lower, but the message was coming from the Premier a couple times.
So a cabinet minister called you?
Yeah, but also the unions would every once in a while too. Both got the same answer.
Which was what?
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your advice. And did you do what they asked?
I can't think of any of the cases where we did what they asked.
But you understand that they, as part of their job, they sometimes
But as
have to do
Keith
that.
said, it's governance that is independent of the sponsors. Both, and it isn't just government, it's also the unions would get upset if we made certain investments. And we'd say, no, our pension plans are there for one reason and one reason only, and that is to secure the financial future of their members for the long term, forever. Because if they're not secure, they're going to become a burden on the economy, and they're going to drag the economy down. So that's the only reason they exist. They don't exist for government policy.
Economic development.
Government policy that says people shouldn't be destitute in their old age, yes, but not for public policy
And
of economic.
that's understand. Like when you look at the funding of a pension plan, 20% comes from the contributions from members and the employers. So 80% is the investments over the life of that pension.
So they better be good.
They better be good. It's the big driver. And
So a 1% change in returns would be, around 25% of total assets. So if you've got a $200 billion plan, who's going to make up the other $50 billion?
Right. Talking real money here.
The other interesting part of this discussion is I had one with my sisters. We get together a number of times a year. One of them is a retired teacher, and her husband is a retired teacher. They get very emotional when they read things like that's our money, and you better not touch it. So I think that's the other dimension in all this, is people take this very personally. And when they see other people...
their money. It is their money.
It's their money.
We give them a statement every year that says this is their money.
Well, somebody, I can't remember who brought this up, but Stephen Poloz, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, is now being tasked by the federal government to set up this working group to attract more investment into Canada. So let's get some wisdom for him on this. What would you tell him? The makeup of his, first of all, have anybody asked you to be on the committee?
We have received an email about participating. I'm not sure being on the committee or how many people are going to be in this working group, but we have received an email to participate.
Okay, well, he's right there in that camera.
Okay.
What would you tell him?
So I'll tell him what I already told him. So I think he has to hit the pension plans, of course, because I think they have a depth of experience, like folks like Jim and Keith, who've run the plans, have been through it, have been asked to do this by multiple groups before, and some of the complications to actually doing these sorts of investments. Like, what does it really mean? Because people always think it's just the risk and return. It's about the pipeline, it's about the governance, all those things. I would also say, look at the work that was recently done by another group called the Sustainable Finance Action Council. So same budget and same fall economic statement, next page. And this was a group of 25 Canadian financial institutions. So all the big banks, all the big insurance, the property and casualty, and pension plans got together and said, what do we actually need in Canada to attract capital that's aligned with our climate transition? And we made recommendations over the course of 3 years, largely unanswered by the government today. So here's a really great example where they convened 25, and we all agreed. Like, this is the phenomenal thing. We all agreed. So we agreed on what is needed from a disclosure point of view, what is needed from what is called a taxonomy or a guide that's quite common now globally. There's over 40 that are in development today.
Who'd you give those recommendations to?
To the Government of Canada, the Department of Finance, and Environment of Climate Change.
Who would you have expected to hear back from on that?
Deputy Prime Minister Freeland and Minister Guilbeault.
And you heard nothing?
We have not heard anything officially back yet. So we've submitted, so I chaired the taxonomy group, and we submitted our paper in fall of 2022.
This is almost 2 years ago now.
And what this does for, taxonomy is kind of not a common word, but think of, when you go buy an appliance. Jim wants to buy a new dishwasher. He wants an energy-efficient dishwasher. You see the Energy Star rating on it. And you can tell immediately is it energy efficient or not. I don't think Jim would argue with the salesperson. He would believe that there's standards associated with that. It's the same idea for different types of investments. What sort of buildings are green? What sort of buildings are on the transition pathway? What sort of energy usage does that mean, et cetera, an emissions profile? And so this is a technical guide. It would be custom for Canada, but we'll let global markets come because they can understand the transition. This is what the roadmap we put together. So we're at a year and a half, no answer. We even published further papers and guidance on how to structure the governance, not published yet. So again, I feel like, okay, here's a really great example. You want money from the pension community, but yet separate panel, 3 years of effort, no answer.
I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but is there any excuse for a lack of response all this time later?
Well, I get perhaps it's because the answer isn't the answer they wanted to have or they feel comfortable with. In my meetings with government over the years, I've said 5 things you need to do to attract capital to this country. The first one was that your rules have to be very clear. And they can't change. You need regulatory bodies that set out the principles in advance to attract money that's going to invest here for 10, 20 years. They can't be at the whim of a change. You need to address interprovincial trade barriers.
Absolutely.
Every single study that's ever been done says that costs us somewhere around 3/4 point of GDP every single year.
It's a political mountain too high to climb. Anyway, but I take your point.
Look at the assets that you own that are not core to your mission. If you need money for healthcare, you've got a couple sources, just like a household. If they have money, or if they want money for something, they can either get a higher paying job, i.e. tax, if you're a government, or sell something. And, you know, there's no reason why the province of Ontario needs to be in the liquor business. There is no reason that the province or that the federal government needs to be in the airport business. There's no reason why Canada doesn't have toll roads or toll bridges like every single other nation in the world. Why don't we do these things? It's politically tough.
Yeah.
You're going to get attacked from the left. You're going to get attacked from the unions and all of that stuff. But don't put it on the backs of pensioners. Do the job that you're supposed to do. I think there are ways they can, and they have taken steps here to endeavor to reduce risk, to attract in institutional funding through the Canada Infrastructure Bank, through the Ontario Infrastructure Bank. These are mechanisms that have been set up. And then finally, they can use their own tax structure or tax policy to attract money. Things like flow-through shares, things like fast write-offs, all of those types of the traditional tax mechanisms that they've used in the past. And I sit back and look at this also in the context of the recent budget that has increased capital gains tax. That moves against, I mean, that, let's not get into the merits of whether they need the money and it's the best way to get the money and all that stuff. But the signal they're sending is not an incentive for risk-taking.
Governor Polas, we have lots of advice for you here, apparently, and it's all free of charge. All you got to do is flip on TVO. We want to thank Keith Ambasher and Barbara Zvon on that side of the table, and Jim Leach on this side of the... You guys used to own the Toronto Maple Leafs, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
I won't ask. I won't ask. Did you buy them? You bought them?
Win then
You bought them and sold them?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Next year. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
The single most important thing we could possibly do for climate is liberate women and give them control of their bodies and economic opportunities, because every time that happens, population collapses.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.